Good afternoon once again. Lovely to see you all here in the British Library Theatre, and welcome to those of you watching online around the world and watching in the future when this becomes a legendary piece of film footage. No pressure. Thank you again for joining us. This is the final event of the session of the final event celebrating our exhibition, Fantasy Realms of Imagination, and it's a great opportunity for film designers, games designers to reflect on how fantasy reflects into their work, and into this one in particular where we're talking about the way the fantasy literature comes in. As before, if you want to ask a question, there'll be opportunity later on, and those online can also ask a question through the form. Our chair today is Lucia Pietrusti, who's head of ecologies at Serpentine. There you go. And she will introduce us to the panel. And we also have Deb Riley joining us on screen all the way from Australia, where it's certainly not this time in the afternoon. Good afternoon. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, John. And let me just say thanks so much to Joe, Paton and Will. I'm speaking with you, especially because I don't particularly belong to the world that I'm going to get an insight into, and hopefully we'll share that insight together. It's also been amazing to listen to the conversations as they have been happening over the last few hours. I've learned so much, and I'm hoping that some of those things come into the conversation now. I guess I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about why I think you've asked me to ask you some questions. Namely, why world building plays such an important part at the moment, at least in my head, in the way that we relate, or that culture relates to the present. Certainly in the face of environmental breakdown and unequally experienced environmental breakdown the world over, we find ourselves at an impasse with regards to what kind of worlds we're allowed to imagine and able to imagine, and how much imagination it might take to start also building and worlding worlds that are generative, optimistic, positive in the face of so much, impending dystopia. And so I suppose it was around that reflection that I became completely obsessed by, your professions really, concept art, production design, those professions that make it their, I suppose, daily life to imagine and build worlds from scratch. So it's a huge, huge honor to be in the presence of you three. And Deb, you really don't make Sydney look like it's 3 o'clock in the morning, I have to say. Deborah Riley, you started your design study as an architecture student, and I think this will come up. You worked on The Matrix as a set designer, and then your first art direction was the closing ceremonies of the 2000 Summer Olympics in Sydney, which is super cool. And in 2008, you moved to LA and became the production designer of the 4th season of Game of Thrones, which I trust needs no introduction. And that work on Game of Thrones, which I believe was all the way until the final season, earned you 4 consecutive Emmy Awards, 3 Art Directors Guild Awards, and a BAFTA. For all your work. So congratulations on all of those. And you have recently also designed the science fiction television series 3-Body Problem, which I think is coming out in about a month on Netflix, based on the novel of the same name by Liu Shixin. Next to me is Adam Brockbank, a film concept artist and illustrator, and I think it is absolutely true that you have worked on some of the most successful and exciting film franchises and just films over the last 2 decades. There are some that aren't in your bio that I found out about this morning that I was incredibly excited. Some of my favorite films as well.
Which ones?
Well, actually, I'm a bit embarrassed to say this, but I was very excited about Captain America.
Oh, really?
Because I'm a big Marvel fan. And it's not the kind of thing that I can say in the art world, but anyways, we're here. And all 8 of the Harry Potter movies, yes. 4 of the recent Star Wars releases.
6.
6?
Oh, well, 1 hasn't been released yet.
Okay, so 5.5. And you've also got a graphic novel series
yes.
called, is it It's pronounced mesolith?
Mesolith.
Mesolith. And
good.
Htay? It's very good.
Oh, it's very
We'll
good.
talk about it. Htay, who started your career as a theatre designer, or trained as a theatre designer, before turning to TV and film. And you've been working on features for about 10 years, including World War Z, Edge of Tomorrow, several Star Wars films, and then No Time to Die, also another franchise that I'm a big fan of, the Bond movies. And recently you worked as the production designer of Ant-Man and Wasp: Quantumania, designing a quantum realm that I'm sure we'll talk about a lot. Your bio says that you're production designing a new project with Taika Waititi, and for the life of me, I couldn't find any information online. So I will, whatever you can share.
A project on pause.
And you're also developing mixed reality and XR artworks and projects with Joe Paton as Htay Design. So, having said that, I think we'll start with Deb, just to have a kind of quick wake up. And I'm going to just ask all three of you to spend a few minutes just telling us about what you do, how you do it, what does it mean to be a production designer, a concept artist. Deb, shall we start with you? I think you can also prompt the slides.
Yeah.
I won't touch anything, so I won't break anything.
First of all, thanks so much for having me here. It seems weird to be here in Sydney, and I'm sorry I'm not there in person. But anyway, if we were to go back to the first slide, not that one, there we go. The best way that I can illustrate production design and world building is by taking a look at the interior and exterior of Dragonstone Castle, which we established on Game of Thrones in season 7. This was a huge moment for the character of Daenerys Targaryen. It was her big homecoming, and it was also a massive opportunity for the art department. So we needed to find 4 things. First of all, a landing spot for her. She would have to arrive by boat. She would then go through some grand entrance gates, up a mighty set of stairs, and then inside Dragonstone Castle, and then through a series of rooms, and the most dramatic of which was the Dragonstone Audience Chamber. And so after being briefed by our showrunners, David and Dan, 2 producers, myself and the Spanish locations team, crisscross Spain, going inside all of the most incredible castles and looking for the most spectacular countryside. Believe me, it was no hardship. But when we arrived at Zumaya Beach, which is what you see here, we didn't yet understand just how the DNA of this place would come to define Dragonstone. It turns out that this particular stretch of coast is incredibly special and unique. And those big slabs appear to sort of soar out of the water and then cling to the cliffs. It's utterly spectacular. And so the problem was that the sea is often too rough and we wouldn't be able to land our skiffs. And there was absolutely no room where we could put our grand entrance gates. So next slide, please. And then we were taken along the coast a little bit further, and we found, just go back to that slide, yep, to this place called San Juan Gatchtalaguche. And yeah, even though it had access problems and and it was this solid stone bridge with 200 steps, it seemed to us to be the most obvious piece of location finding that Game of Thrones had ever found. And on to the next slide. And so by the time I got back to our art department, which was based in Belfast, we put this piece of concept art together, which showed us everything we knew about the island of Dragonstone, including our location at Zumaya Beach. Next slide. And then we started detailing these entrance gates, which, funnily enough, were originally scripted to be of dragon's feet. But the problem was, once you started drawing dragon's feet without actually seeing the rest of the body, they just looked like chicken's feet. And so we had to rethink about that and kept them as the dragon heads. Next slide. And there's one of the heads being sculpted. There's our art director, Phil Elton, leaning on one. And the following slide. And then we ended up building our entrance gates on stage. And then these gates would be dropped pixel by pixel into our Spanish location. That's our director, Mark Mylod, there sitting at the side. Next slide. And so it seemed to me that the most important thing about the interior of Dragonstone was that the whole idea of the building should hinge on this amazing rock strata found at the location. And so if the whole building were to be built around the strata, it made sense that then the throne should be carved out of it. And so therefore the throne became not a movable piece of furniture, but something that was absolutely intrinsic to the building. Next slide. And because Dragonstone had been established in earlier seasons as being a series of cave-like rooms, it was important to me that the walls should soar out of those rooms. And the triangle with the locked off top, that became a repeatable image of power. And so we went to a lot of trouble with this concept art to try and develop it as closely as possible to what it would be like when it was built. And then the following slide. And then looking from the top shot, when Daenerys would enter that space, it was important to me that we have those hexagonal tiles, which was my nod to the hexagonal basalt extrusions up at the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, but also that there be this carved ancient Targaryen sigil carved into the floor, so that when she walked across it, it would be as though her family history is part of the fabric of the building. And the next slide. Maybe one after that. There we go. And so a white card model was built, and here I am pitching it. As you can see, it was a very tough crowd. But the important thing was that I try and get the producers to understand exactly what I was aiming for. Following slide. And then by this time was running short, and the plasterers produced a whole range of different textures. And as soon as one was approved and they were stapled on, the carpenters stood up the flats as fast as possible. Next slide. And our construction manager sent a team of plasterers down to Zamaya to take molds or squeezes of that particular rock strata so that the exterior textures would match, or that the interior textures would match the exterior textures perfectly. That's our most kind and patient, talented plasterer there, Peter Black, who still sends me a Christmas card every year. And the next slide. And yes, what seemed like a good idea at the time, which was putting stairs up to the throne, was actually incredibly limiting because it meant that our machines couldn't access the whole of the space. So it meant that all of the painting needed to be finished first before anybody else could get on and do their jobs. Next slide. And so there it was. There's a still from the episode. And I had, we had managed to build the show a brutalist cathedral. So for somebody who had started thinking she was working on a medieval fantasy, I was incredibly proud of all of the different architectural styles that I'd managed to establish within the show. What's following is a couple of minutes of the last moments of season 7, which is virtually dialogue free, but what it shows is Daenerys going through that journey. So we'll see her on location in Spain, and then she goes through our entrance gates on stage, up the stairs in Spain, and back into the building again on stage in Belfast. So if you could play that. There you go.
Thank you so much, Deb. I'm really going to try and be analytical and refuse the terrible temptation to just go, that's so cool. This will just keep happening. Adam, do you want to take us through?
Oh, sure. I'm sort of lost now in that world. Okay, yeah, interestingly, let's stop there, because we are actually back in Game of Thrones, but you won't recognise it, and this is a bit naughty of me, because it's from the abandoned Game of Thrones series that Luke Hull designed, and that I worked on very briefly. But it's a good example, I think, of, or a good introduction to what we do as concept artists. I mean, we provide images to communicate ideas. And for example, this is another vast hall. And I don't know if you can make out, I don't know how big it is on the screen, but in the background there's a sculpture carved into the solid rock, and a bit like what we'd just seen, this space is also carved out of solid rock. It's carved, in fact, out of Casterly rock, thousands of years before the events of Game of Thrones. And the man that you see battling a lion is Lan. And Lan is the great ancestor of the Lannisters. More than that, I don't think I probably already said too much anyway. Next slide, please. So that's, as you've seen already, a sort of a set illustration. And here's another example of a set illustration. In this instance, it's Rise of Skywalker. And I don't know if you remember Kajimi, was it called? The Snowy City? But at one stage, they were going to enter a sort of club, a sort of nightclub. And we went through several designs and several suggestions for this, and this was one of my sort of early sketches. So as a concept artist, you have to have quite a thick skin, because you are going to do a tremendous amount of artwork that is never seen and never used and rejected. But what you're doing is you're asking questions. You're asking questions with images, which is such an efficient way to ask a question of a director or a producer or a production designer. Because everything is there for the eye to see immediately. You don't have to describe. You receive this impression and you react or respond. Next slide. So, yeah, one of the wonderful things about this job is the range of things you get to think about and play with. So you can be illustrating environments, but you can also be offering ideas for props. You don't know if you may recognize this prop, the puking pastels dispenser from Weasley's Wizard Wheezes from the Harry Potter films. And yeah, I mean, this was one prop of many within this extraordinary set. There are all kinds of things going on in there. This had the advantage of being actually physically quite big, so you couldn't miss it. Next. Sorry to say goodbye to her. Creature design. Now these days, back in the days of Potter, the concept artists who were working on it, we got to try everything. It's become a little more specialized now, and there are people who design creatures, and that's all they do, and they do it superbly well. But back then, we could all have a go. And I was lucky enough to land the the centaurs in the Half-Blood Prince. And this illustration is interesting because this is quite far down the line. We're at a point here where we've got an approved design. We've had a fantastic sculptor collaborate with me. He's made a life-size centaur. It's even been flocked. But at that stage, the question this illustration is asking is two things. One is, do centaurs, what do they wear? What do they have? Do they have any clothing? Is it simply a flivver and a bow? Perhaps a necklace, perhaps not. And the other question it was asking was scars. So I don't know if you can see them, you probably can't. But actually in this illustration there are, I don't know if any of you have ever ridden a horse or been pony trekking with school. Because the pony trekking ponies are a really good example of this, because they bite each other all the time. And I have a very strong memory, probably because I was so terrified of being on the back of a pony, on a pony trek through the Welsh hills, and looking at the flanks of the pony in front of me, just covered in scars and bites. And I know it seems like a tiny detail, but when you see something, your eye takes in all this information instantly, and it makes a difference. These aren't, for example, these centaurs, they're not thoroughbreds. They live in the forest, and they're warriors. So they would be scarred. They would be dirty, not brushed. Shall we move on? And then here's an example of another thing that we address, which might be a visual effect. So what does it look like, and how does this work? And I remember with this illustration for one of the, I think it's the last Deathly Hallows, I did several versions with different approaches. I think it had already been decided that this sort of thing would happen, would manifest. But to begin with, it was just Voldemort's 2 sleeves. Then it became 4, and eventually it became this sort of spider-like something. Next. And then the other thing that we do is we offer an illustration of something that might be a combination of a build and a set extension, a digital set extension these days. So that's what this is an example of. It helps the production designer and the visual effects supervisor come to a kind of an answer about how they're going to combine what needs to be built, what doesn't need to be built. I'm sure you can speak to that too, Will. But also, for example, this Jedi temple that Luke has led on the island, or actually it's not on the island, but wherever it is, or is it on the island? I can't remember. We never see it from the outside. We only see a few bits of one of the huts from the inside. So someone has to come up with what it looks like. Obviously that, I do my initial illustrations, and then that gets passed down the pipeline to the visual effects team. Next slide. How am I doing? Am I keeping within time?
You're fine.
Next one. Oh, was that all of them?
Yeah.
I thought I'd put a costume in there, because that's the other thing I do sometimes. But
We'll ask you about costumes.
yeah.
Will, do you want to take us through your work?
Sure.
Thank
you. So I think these first slides, so it's a little bit about my process, and this is, if we just hold on this for a moment. So this is regarding the quantum realm. So basically, it could have been anything. And I was thinking about it a lot, read a lot about quantum theory, and you've obviously got a script or an ever-developing script, and you're trying to always service that narrative. But at the same time, I'm trying to create something that doesn't exist and provide, just for myself to begin with, some sort of internal logic that I can then begin to inhabit with the different peoples and the worlds that we need to travel to and meet all the story beats, because we are servicing a story, a narrative, which is a film in this instance, but give it a visual story too. So the idea here, and it was one thing that was talked about from the early onset of the treatment to the script itself, was this idea of worlds within worlds. And I think that we'd seen stuff in previous Marvel films and Ant-Man films where they shrunk down and down and down and down. So the concept here was, and this, I was doing a lot of reading, but also picture research, and I came across this image, and what I loved about this was that it felt like it was worlds within worlds. So if you were to just go beyond the hand and go into that, and then we can now move forward, this idea of interconnecting bubbles and everything having an inner space but an outer space, but it could actually be moving across one another constantly. So if we just play to the next one. And I wanted to combine this. And this image, I came across this image probably when I was a teenager, actually. I nicked a book from our school library, don't tell them, about the particle explosion. I was very interested in physics. And I came across this. And for me, this sort of cemented those two previous images, at least in my head. So if you're in the quantum realm and we had to make it sort of real, if we just pause on if we go back to this image, yeah. The idea of this was that if you then, what's the materiality of the quantum realm? Is it just simply energy, or how are we going to make actors walk through this sort of space? How are we going to tell a story in this environment? So the idea of this was subatomic particles that perhaps when they age and die, they go through different material states, which in effect become metal or stone. So I could then bring in kind of real world-ish materials into the quantum realm so that we can actually build worlds within it, build structures, build forms, and build out landscapes. So that I was just trying to think about that sort of materiality and the varying states of energy that we would come across. So if we now move forward. And then this is a piece of concept art where I was just trying to explain this to everyone. And this was this idea of shrinking down and through these different worlds, and these worlds would be constantly interconnecting. These came across these images of wax that had been poured into water. And again, it was the idea of things moving, that you could be in one world and it would be constantly moving away from you. And this is, I don't tend to show this sort of stuff normally, but these are some of my sketchbook things, really early ideas. I was looking at fractals, bifurcation, and then trying to bring together the idea of pattern language, which are from particle explosions. So the idea of Janet's house had been a particle that smashed down through layers of the quantum realm, created these patterns, sort of cooled and then turned into rock patterns, much like Deb was looking at in Spain, those sort of rock patterns. And then over time, the idea of quantum flora and fauna growing over those things. So again, I was trying to create real-world, recognizable history in a place that doesn't exist. So here, this is this sort of crater site. What if this abode that she discovered is in effect a crater? Because I could play again with scale. What if it was totally overgrown by weird quantum creatures and sort of energy? And then this image here was, again, this idea. It's a little plan drawing. Quite often when you get a script, you'll get story beats and you need to plot different spaces. If we just pause on this one here. So the idea, again, of taking that language of circles and interconnectedness and layers and changing things. So I pitched this idea that in this space we had various scenes, and one of these scenes had a fight in it. And this is no longer in the film, but it was the idea of four-dimensional space, and that someone could come through a doorway here, but then they could appear over there. And space would be morphed. So you could constantly be moving through it, but not in a linear fashion, in a completely crazy fashion. So if we keep playing forward, there's also nods to the way in which this sort of control desk echoes some of the stuff that's seen in a previous film on Earth. But this idea of layers and materiality, and these are just some of the sketches that I'm doing in my sketchbook that I used to do concept art as well, and this is just my method, I guess, of sketching ideas, and I pull out a lot of reference. And this came closer to the actual final structure, which we had to simplify. We had to shrink, literally. Who'd have thought in an Ant-Man film we had to shrink it down and make it smaller because of the budget, of all things. And this is the idea, again, of taking that language and building a city within it, which is Chronopolis. And again, I was just trying to take that language and reapply that idea of circles and interconnectedness to create order out of chaos, which is the big bad in that film. Kang was trying to do that. So the quantum realm is a trap, is a jail, but he's trying to bring order within it and use that energy. So if we just pause on this, so again, it's the same shape language that I'm using, but I just created order through it here. And the idea of taking energy in those strands, so all the lines and the pattern work that you've seen before of particle explosions, and you've seen the landscape and seen arcing through the skies and what have you, here he's taken it and formalised it to control it. That was the kind of thinking behind this set design. And the fight scene, for example, that I mentioned before, which had happened in a previous set, had gone, so we had to shrink that and then make this set bigger. I think well, you'll see later on, but it was a 100-foot diameter set, up on, I don't know, 6 or 8 feet rostra, which is quite a chunky build. And if we play forward, so again, I would do a drawing like this, and it would get handed over to the art directors to work out. And this was me spitballing ideas with the concept artists about what could the throne be like, and the form language in the room. And this again was taking. So I always think micro, macro, micro, macro. Much to the annoyance of my family, but and this was the idea of the worlds within worlds, again taking that form language and shape language, and how could that manifest it. So at the same time that I'm trying to think about interior spaces, I'm also trying to think about exterior spaces. This is Janet's abode. You can see the actual build on the stage, and it had to be destroyed. You can see the form language there. Again, it's those basalt columns again. And then this is the interior of Kang, so you could see a much more formal structure, using the materiality, the idea of those kind of quantum metals that I talked about. This is sort of an intermediate, which is the city, which is down in the quantum realm. Lots of fabulous concept art in there as well. This is the throne, which in itself is a sort of time and spatial machine. And again, it was meant to be a pure version of this idea of all the bubbles, that they're now concentric, and the rings that move around it. So it's simply taking one idea and trying to intersperse it throughout the whole film. Again, shots of the quantum realm, which I think is at the beginning of the film, where he crashes. So you see the formalised version of the sphere crashed in this chaotic mess. So that was the kind of, I think that's the last one on the quantum realm. And there's one other quick little case study I wanted to show you. More quantum realm, it's a big place. Little place, but big when you're in it. It's all relative. Again, just to show you, I mean, there are people, this is one of Darren's models, there's a couple of the artists here in the audience as well, and there's Adam, who can illustrate and make these things way better than I can. But you end up with all these beautiful things that don't always get seen by everyone. And again, this would be reference for the VFX department and for the other departments, for the physical SFX department to help build a rig. We have all of this stuff. This is Corellia, very quick sketchbook ideas. Now, the difference about this project, which was solo, and I was a concept designer on this, but I wanted to illustrate this as an idea. A lot of the language, because it was Star Wars, was kind of already there. So, Quantum Realm, not there, really. Star Wars, there's a lot of known language, and I think a lot of this stems back to, for a lot of us who got to work on, say, Rogue One, we went back and looked at the old films in the way that we do our research of, whether it's castles or dragons or Victorian age or wherever it might be. And our research was in those films, because when you look at them, the original print, you have stormtroopers walking down the corridor with bits of gaffer tape under their armpit, and sections of the set are kind of slightly falling out. So we had to update all of that kind of quality and get that really, really right for this day and age. And so the idea of Corellia here, here are all the story beats, but it didn't feel very Star Wars when I was doing these sort of sketches. So we're like, well, how can we condense? We liked some of the aesthetic, and again, I do a lot of referencing. I put together this sheet where we were looking at, I was pulling out sort of shipbuilding yards and the futurist project for Tokyo Bay, and then trying to distill it down into shape language. And there was another artist on this who was, well, there was a whole bunch of us working on this, trying to develop this sort of shape and form language to distill it down into this is going to be a recognisable place. And then that developed through these little thumbnails into a sort of a detailed study of, right, okay, what is the noise level of habitation within it? What is the actual overall scale? You know, what is the human scale and the starship scale? Because again, you're constantly pushing and pulling between different scales and different ways of seeing the world. And these are just some of my illustrations to help illustrate that. And I think that this is probably the last one. There we are, there we go. And I think that was just to give you a slight insight into some of my two different approaches, but process.
You're referencing the Emperor's Tower there.
Yeah, I am, yes.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. I can't believe we have so little time left to ask you questions. About 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions that you might have. So I want to start from from your bios again, but basically just observing the fact that you emerge and have histories and paths in different disciplines, actually, architecture, art, theatre design. And it feels as though, as you're presenting your work, that trajectory actually leads to different ways of even just talking about the work, conceptualizing what the work is even, or sort of making sense around it. So I wanted to ask you about the influence of your background on your practice. And maybe we can start with Deb.
Yeah, absolutely. My background influences everything. I studied architecture for 3 years and then thought I was drawing too many straight lines. And so I swapped to study stage design at our School of Dramatic Art here called NIDA. And so I did that for 3 years after the 3 years of architecture. So I come from a very solid background in construction and the practicalities, I guess, of buildings. So that's something that I take very seriously. And so it's, for me, production design is not just something that should be admired, but something that you also need as an audience to absolutely believe in. Just like the actors who inhabit your sets also need to believe in that world.
Thank you. Maybe, Will, we jump to you for a minute. Do you find, I hear a lot of actually science, interest in science, so perhaps...
Yeah, I wanted to be an astronaut.
Ah!
Yeah, no, I wanted to be an astronaut, and I had a place to do a course at university in astronautical and aeronautical engineering. But I also loved movies as well. And it was either be an astronaut or be a film director. And I went, film director looks a lot easier. And it is. But no, actually, I was actually fascinated by design as well. And I went to Wimbledon School of Art and studied theatre design, but specialised in film. And again, you just mentioned about background and influence that takes. And as a theatre, I think the training that I had was one of theatre design, where I'm working very closely with, the text and the director, and you are growing this thing. And, and I think Sarah Greenwood mentioned, for those of you who were in her chat earlier with Katie Spencer, this idea of how can you distill this story down into something quite simple? So on a theatrical stage set, how can you help tell that story? How are you going to service that story, the character, the place, the environment? And I think, that's always stuck with me. Yes, you get to play in like crazy big playgrounds like the Marvel Universe or Star Wars and what have you. But actually as a designer, as a production designer, servicing the story and trying to tell a visual story, for me, is also really, really important. And also there's the aspect of working with other craftsmen and women and the art department and all the different construction, set decoration, everyone, the artistry that's brought is also part of the joy. That process is very, very joyful when it works.
Thank you so much. Adam, you studied art, and besides the sort of exquisite quality of the images that you make, I also wanted to ask you simultaneously about your work as a graphic novelist.
Yes.
Are those, I mean, they must feel like quite different parts of you. Or not?
There are crossovers, of course. I mean, it's both forms are about narrative. And what I storyboarded before I concepted. And storyboarding is almost like a bridge between the comic book and concept art. And so really, I mean, I suppose the biggest thing in my past that informs what I do now is how much television I watched as a child. Just copious, vast amounts of television. That and comic books, which I discovered and devoured. But interestingly, I devoured them from the artwork. I devoured the artwork, and the artwork that attracted me back then actually was the artwork that Marvel were producing. Because back in my childhood,